The tales of predatory innovation. So we started last time talking about how before Facebook there was Myspace, and before Myspace there was Friendster, and before Friendster there were other social network sites. So the idea is to show that innovation, or people who present themselves as disruptors or innovators, are often forgetting how much they take from what's already existing, what has been on the market, what has been tried, the success, the failure. And also the ideas that other people had around them. So once upon a time, Mark Zuckerberg created Facebook. And what we're going to take a look at quickly today is what existed at that time, what was successful at that time, what was struggling at that time, and see to which extent other people had a similar idea. So was the idea of Facebook radically different from everything that was happening, or was it in the air? And there's a quote from one of the books on the birth of Facebook, called Facebook: The Inside Story, by Stephen Levy, where someone learns about the idea that Mark Zuckerberg had of Facebook, about connecting a social network with Harvard students. And he said in his head, is he building a Friendster for Harvard? And which shows that, you know, it was already something that could be compared to something that existed. And the Stephen Levy says, in truth, the idea was out there for the taking. Social media was exploding, Friendster was a phenomenon, and millions of people were piling onto Myspace. So it's quite telling that at the moment where the idea of Facebook was pitched around, when Mark Zuckerberg was looking for funding, when he was meeting a venture capitalist, when he was looking for investment, when he was trying to recruit, when he was presenting the idea, people could connect it to things that were already on the market and readily available. For example, Friendster and Myspace. Not to say that it is the same thing, but it shows that there was proximity. Of course, there's this idea because of the movie The Social Network, that is mostly based on the book by Ben Mesrich, that is, it's not around me right now, that's called Accidental Billionaires. And there's this idea that Mark Zuckerberg stole the idea of Facebook from other people in Harvard. I want to show you today that it's a very limited view of how innovation comes to existence, how people get an idea. So we will talk a little bit about what was happening on the Harvard campus. We'll talk a little bit about the Winklevoss twins and their associate Divya Naranda. I'll talk about that, but what I want you to realize is that, for example, in 2004, when Mark Zuckerberg was trying to recruit Aaron Sittig, who was a former Napster engineer and who was going to be a designer at Facebook, Stephen Levy described through an interview with Aaron Sittig that Aaron Sittig already knew that the future of social networking was up for grabs. It was out there. Everybody had originally loved Friendster, says Stephen Levy, but the company was blowing its lead with poor performance. Now there was a race for dominance, with a company from Southern California, Myspace, taking the lead. So social media was already there, and it was already out there, and there was already a market. So Facebook was not creating, it was not a first mover, they were not creating social networking. They were entering a market that was already a few years old. So there were already experiments, there was already a business leader, there was already a former business leader. So there's a wider context that we cannot limit to just what was happening in Harvard. But let's quickly talk about HarvardConnection.com. We have the story from the book Accidental Billionaire, and we have it also from the movie The Social Network. So almost everybody know that the Winklevoss twins and Divya Naranda had this idea for a website that would be called harvardconnection.com, that would be exclusive, on which students could connect with one another. And they invited Zuckerberg, after hearing about the infamous project Face Mash, where Mark Zuckerberg had downloaded pictures of women in students who were students at Harvard College, and people could rate them. So hot or not at the time applied to fellow students. And when they heard about that, what they took from that is that he was probably a brilliant coder. So they approached him to consult on their ID, and he started working with them in January of 2004. A month later, on February 4th, he launched his own website, which was called thefacebook.com. He then avoided the Winklevoss brother and Nivea Narendra. We've seen that all in the movie. And then they claimed that Zuckerberg had stolen their ID. Whether it was true or not, fully or not, what we know for a fact is that there was a trial, and then there was a settlement in 2008 where the Winklevoss twins and Narendra got 1.2 million shares of Facebook stock. So the courts must have found some proximities between the IDs to give to these Harvard students such a big part of the company. So there was something that was taken from there. Ben Mesrich, who wrote Accidental Billionaire, that inspired the movie, describes a bit more in details that the idea of harvardconnection.com was not that advanced, and that the facebook.com website that Zuckerberg produced after a month of consulting for the Winklevoss and Narendra was slightly different. Again, the courts have decided that they were close enough to award them with stock, but still they were not the only source of information. In his account, Ben Mesrich also mentioned how Zuckerberg looks into Myspace, into Friendster, into House System, so different social networks that were already in place and already successful. We talked a bit about it the last time, but in the book An Ugly Truth Inside Facebook's Battle for Domination, Shira Frankel and Cecilia Kang mention another proximity with the project of Alan Greenspan, who was in Harvard at that time, and as they describe, and I'm quoting them here, Zuckerberg was focused on one student already well ahead of him. Earlier that fall, a junior named Aaron Greenspan introduced a networking site called The Facebook. It was a simple site designed to look professional. Greenspan's idea was to create a resource that could be useful to professors and job hunters. We know from their investigation in the book that Zuckerberg and Greenspan contacted each other, talked with one another. They even had that idea at some point that someone should merge their project together, but they had two key divergences, which was one who would integrate the other, and both wanting the other to be subsumed in their project, so they couldn't figure out who would be eaten by whom. And the other question was also very important, which was what was the fundamental aim of the site? And Zuckerberg, as they say in the book, found Greenspan's site to be too functional, too professional, and Zuckerberg wanted something that would be more social, more friendly. With his website. They couldn't merge together. They then talked about sharing maybe resources, database of users, data servers, but they never partnered up in the end. But it's difficult not to see how the idea of harvardconnection.com connected with a project that was called explicitly the Facebook, even though Facebook is a common name in the US, as we say in French, trombinoscope, where you can see other students in their pictures. It means that just on the Harvard campus, there were already quite a lot of things happening that inspired Mark Zuckerberg. And I'm saying inspired without any irony here. I'm saying it truly as, okay, people have ideas and I'm going to try to make something out of it and come up with my own idea. Facebook also, and Mark Zuckerberg in particular, learned a lot from Myspace and Friendster. Again, there were already a few years of having a market for a social network, and when they first described the idea in Accidental Billionaires, in the book of Ben Mesrich, the reference to Friendster and Myspace comes back regularly as a similarity, as a proximity, but also as something that had limitation and that they wanted to innovate from. For example, when Eduardo Saverin is thinking about Facebook, he says that about the other existing website. For all its hype as a social network, Friendster and Myspace, which was just beginning to catch fire nationwide, was really just about searching through people you didn't know and trying to hook up with them. The difference was on Facebook, you already knew the people you invited to be your friends. So you see, Facebook comes into a market that is not completely or not better. When Sean Parker discovers so future close associate with the creation of Facebook, when Sean Parker discovers Facebook for the first time, he also compares it to Myspace and to Friendster, but sees to which extent it is better and it shows more promise. When Mark Zuckerberg and the team at Facebook are thinking about how to design the first versions of the website, they can turn to existing social network and see what has been tested, what works and doesn't work. So the prior companies become a source of inspiration with successes and failure, features that are attractive or unappreciated, and from which you can build your own version. So Facebook shares with Friendster a simple, non-customizable profile page and the ability to connect with friends. This is very similar in that way. And Mark Zuckerberg learned from Myspace the importance of sharing content, pictures, musics, and connecting around these topics. So they were able to turn to what was already existing, what had succeeded and what had failed in order to build their own version. And this is why I don't think it's possible to talk about innovation as radical novelty. You're always building from something, and it's particularly true for Facebook at that time. There had already been a few companies, a few challenges, a few successes, and they did not invent a social network at all. They learned from others to assemble something new. Where it becomes a bit more predatory, and I've talked about it before very quickly, is that in the 2000s, up until late in the 2000s, Myspace is dominating the industry. And they saw Facebook emerge and rise very quickly. So Facebook was the small David and Myspace was the big Goliath. But Julia Angwin, in a book called Stealing Myspace, describes, she was a journalist at the Wall Street Journal at that time, and she describes Myspace trying to acquire Facebook, where it feels like Myspace is the big company that is trying to prey, to be the predator on Facebook. And that's how she describes it. February 2005, Myspace traffic keeps growing at 6% per week. Tom DeWolf, who was the creator, one of the founder of Myspace, meets with Facebook founder Mark Zuckerberg to talk about a merger, but Zuckerberg wants $75 million. DeWolf passes. Later, Julia Angwin describes, and it's 6 months later, fall 2005, Levinson and DeWolf, so still a team of Myspace, meet with Zuckerberg again, who now wants at least $750 million for Facebook. No deal. So it feels like back at that time, Myspace were trying to eat Facebook. So MySpace seemed to be the predator because they were much bigger, much more successful. However, there's been another book published since from the point of view of Facebook, which is the Stephen Levy book that I've already quoted, the Facebook, the Inside Story, that tells an interesting and different story. While they were dominating the market, MySpace and Friendster were struggling technically. For different reasons, their platforms were slow, and that brought a lot of frustration for users. MySpace could be customizable completely, the background, the pictures, everything you put on it. As a consequence, it was quite slow to load, and so users would be frustrated, and they were struggling with scaling up as they were having more and more users, and their codes and servers were outdated already. In this context, under the pretext of discussing an acquisition by MySpace, Facebook's team was actually trying to know more about their competitors' struggles. So they were actually trying to spy on MySpace. Even though they were smaller at Facebook, they thought that it was a good opportunity. They didn't actually want to be bought by MySpace, but they wanted to know more about their culture and their struggle. I'm quoting from the book Facebook, the Inside Story here. Facebook's aim was to gather intelligence. Zuckerberg, Van Natta, and Kohler, team from Facebook, had several meetings with MySpace, their putative rival, just to get to know them better and see if they could learn something. The point for us was to learn and better understand their team and culture and how they thought about their product. The point for them was to buy Facebook, but actually Facebook wanted to spy on MySpace. So you see, the appearance of a predator MySpace that would be bigger and trying to buy out the prey, Facebook that was much smaller, was actually going the other way around and pretending to be interested. Zuckerberg and his team was able to know more about the technical difficulties of MySpace. And they focused at Facebook on solving the technological challenges of scaling up social network platforms. And they were, through these meetings, they learned that their competitors were actually far behind them in terms of engineering. They knew that even though MySpace was the industry leader and much bigger, they were struggling from an engineering standpoint. And so Facebook focused on that and slowly opened its user base. First it was Harvard, then Ivy League. It was first Boston area and then the entire country. And with that focus on technological improvement, Facebook was slowly getting ahead of MySpace, and by 2006 was clearly taking the lead with that focus on improving users' experience. So actually Facebook gathering intelligence on MySpace by pretending to be interested by a buyout was able to find an edge and to cultivate it. All that I'm saying about the proximity between Zuckerberg's ideas with Alan Greenspan, with the Winklevoss twins, with Vivian Aranda, the similarities between Facebook and the previous sites, MySpace and Friendster, is to show that innovation is incremental. You look at what is existing and you find something to contribute to add to. It's not nothing. Yeah, but it kind of changes this representation of entrepreneurs as radical disruptors who invent something that would be radically new, a great novelty. You're always building from something. That being said, Facebook did provide two major new features on their website that really set them apart with the competition. In 2006, they launched Newsfeed. So most of you have no idea, but until 2006, when you were a user of Facebook, you would navigate from your profile to other people's profile to see what people had shared on their page. On September 6, 2006, when you logged in, you arrived to a new landing page, which was called Newsfeed. And it was what we would become the wall, and you would see when you arrived on Facebook an aggregation of all the content posted by in your network, groups, interests, other friends, and it would be organized in a certain order by an algorithm. There were strong resistance at the beginning, but it turned out to be a key feature of Facebook to improve the experience of users. It would also lead to problems later, but that was a radical new feature. Another new one the year after was the developer platform. It was Facebook offering third-party app developers to have a facilitated access to developing apps for Facebook. So they had this idea, and since then the App Store and all the stores I've made it normal, but that was a radical new idea, which was to invite people to contribute to Facebook and to create features for Facebook while being outside of the company. A year later, so in 2008, there was already more than 30,000 apps that were available. So these new features were a radical contribution to the social network. I've talked about what was similar before, but that was radically new. Of course, it comes with challenges. The news feed and the algorithm that shows you content of Facebook has been blamed for creative cognitive bubbles to be twisted politically, and the platform apps had massive data breach and issues of data privacy with the Cambridge Analytica scandal, etc. So these new features are not perfect, and they came to be worked on. But that was the true departure from what was existing before by Mark Zuckerberg and his team. So this idea that Mark Zuckerberg is an apex predator, as we can see some memes over the internet, is a misunderstanding on how innovation works. People who think that entrepreneurs are radical innovators who create something that did not exist before have a twisted version of innovation, and people who think that Mark Zuckerberg is an apex predator who stole his idea from HarvardConnection.com also don't understand how innovation works. Innovation is cumulative and it's collective. I'll talk about that at another point with the work of Mariana Mazzucato. What it means is that you never create something out of nothing, and therefore when you want to innovate, you start by turning left and right to what has been done before you, what is working around you, and it inspires you to create something new. Is it completely new? Absolutely not. It's inspired by others. Have you preyed on the idea of others? Yes, always a little bit. By definition, innovation always has a certain amount of predation. You've taken things from others, but you've made it your own as well. You've brought something new. And Mark Zuckerberg did not invent social networks. They were existing. He took from them, he learned from them, he preyed on some ideas and suggestions that were around him, but it also made something that was slightly different, and then he improved it, and then he hired other people who came on board and had new ideas to create something that was a departure, and that was, since it was a success, we know now, something that was considered an improvement. But there's always a little bit of predation in innovation, and that I'll come back to it in another moment.